Hey, Dave LeCount with HeadGames Motorworks. Today we're going to talk about a GR Corolla build for Nemtec tuning. Check it out. So Nemtec Tuning came to us after they had a failure. So they had a failure, the valves broke, and they threw a rocker. They don't know what happened first. And then the head came to us actually they bought a brand new head, and it came to us because they wanted to make sure that somebody, it was not just a local shop, it was actually going to measure everything out and figure out what the problem could have been. The problem is that we've never had a GR Corolla head in here. We've never seen the parts for it, and it becomes an R&D project. Now, we know that there is parts available, and that's why we took it in. We wanted to possibly get into this market, and so we saw issues right off the bat with the valvetrain. First, I gotta show you guys this cylinder head because it's pretty wild. First off, the valve seats are on the intake side, just something you would never see anywhere. Really, really hard to duplicate the way that it's like scalloped over here. And they do like just maybe a light pocket port, you would call it. But this is, I don't even know what to do here because I've never seen anything like that. OEM valves, you will see that this thing is like super heavy, this intake valve, and you'll notice that they're really, really close in size. They're not crazy different in size, and that's a lot of things that you see in all the newer heads. All the valves are pretty much the same size. You also notice that the valve springs, one has green, one has white. They are at different heights. Now, I've done another spring test on another cylinder head like the BMW, and usually the manufacturer of an aftermarket spring would either change the heights because they're going to use one spring. So what these guys sent us was a set of SuperTech intake and exhaust valves, and this is their black nitride intake valve and their Inconel exhaust valve. And it looks really, really nice. It has a really nice tulip on the backside. I feel like they would flow more. Now, we did not flow it, but it looks like a pretty nice piece. And installed just the same as OEM. Now, we actually had to come to that conclusion because we had issues with the valve springs. The valve springs were really tight to coil bind, and we had to figure out, is it the valve or is it the valve spring itself, because everything was aftermarket and we had no OEM parts. So Nemtec sent us the OEM parts. We were able to measure, and the valve from SuperTech sets up exactly like stock. I think we were within 5 thousandths, which is nothing. And so then we move on to the valve spring. All right, so now we're at the valve spring. It was definitely in the valve spring. The valve spring that was installed, I am not going to throw anybody under the bus. I work with these guys, and I cannot say their name. Not that I work with this particular company, but they're in the industry, and I'm not trying to get sued. So they use this beehive spring, and they use this thick locator. They only use one spring, one size locator, and one retainer, one titanium retainer, and they say that the one size fits all, even though the intake and exhaust have different install heights. So I just wanted to show you guys the lock situation. Now, actually, let me show you this. So this is the valve lock that one of their buddies, I want to say, they use this valve lock a lot. They sell it with this kit. If you notice where the groove is for the valve lock, you see how it's not at the top, it's more towards the center, and it's a very small area. Now I present to you the OEM, and you see the OEM, the lock is up here, or I should say the groove is up here, it's not down there, and it's not as long. What happens when you use a different size lock in this? I know this is going to be almost impossible for you guys to see, but so the lock moves very, very slightly up and down. That's the lock just in the groove. And then you take the one that they were selling with it, and you can see it moves a lot. It moves a lot up and down. And this is going to create a situation where it's going to pull on the groove, and then it's going to be hard to get the valve out. It also won't set up correctly. Set this one up. This is the long lock. We're going to set this up. You can see how the top is protruding outside of the retainer, and the retainer rocks back and forth, and it's also not even near the bottom of the retainer, which is something that's very important. And then I can pull on it really hard, but it doesn't really do anything. And the issue comes apart very, very easily. All right, guys, second time. We're going to use OEM lock in it. And this is how you can tell that somebody sells parts versus actually installs them and knows what to do. Look at this. Does not come apart because it's meant to be, and you can see how it does not push the retainer down, and your install height would be much better, and it really just fits the retainer perfectly. I just want to make sure you guys understand that it wasn't the manufacturer who sold these parts. It was a parts reseller, and they just sell a whole bunch of this manufacturer's parts, and they just throw locks in there, and they obviously have never installed it or measure stuff, and they just called it theirs. They actually put their name on the locks, and they don't actually work. Now, when you go to install it, it actually pulls the retainer, pushes the retainer down 15 thousandths. So you lose 15 thousandths worth of install height on an already close to coil bind spring, but more on that. So what we did was we put it in our Buxton spring tester, and I'm just going to show you the intake side. The intake side is actually the tightest of both sides. So we 1371 install height, and the valve lift is 452. That's the Calford cam that they're installing, and we are going to press the magic button. You can see here we're 97 pounds on the seat, 191 open, and we're only 38 thousandths to coil bind. There's actually a cam that's a little bit bigger than this, so it would coil bind, but being only 38 thousandths to coil bind, the issue here is that not all the valve springs are going to be the same distance to coil bind. It's a little hard to explain, but when you're making a valve spring, they're just not all going to be the same no matter what. They might have the same seat pressure, they might have the same open pressure, but the coil bind will change. Also, we should keep in mind that the lock that they sell with that kit would push it down another 15 thousandths. And if you had 15 thousandths less, you're pretty much at coil bind without doing anything. So here you can see by having a manufacturer selling parts to somebody who doesn't measure, doesn't do anything, and then it all comes down to the customer. And if the customer doesn't measure, you guys are going to be holding onto a basket full of broken parts. So I'm still not going to mention names, but I got a little frustrated with that, and we went to a different valve spring from a different manufacturer, and they use the OEM retainer. No locator, just an OEM retainer, and I present you with option B. All right, so now we're going to try the other spring and see how that works. Oh, hold on, we'll do. Here we got 1.668 install height, and we're at 452 lift. 85 pounds on the seat, 225 open, so a lot more pressure. But look at that clearance to coil bind, 204, 204 thousandths. So what the problem here is, when you have a valve spring that is too far away from coil bind, it will act like a slinky. So if you guys have ever played with a slinky when you were a child, you know as farther you get away, the center will just move around. So what happens is it will get into a certain frequency, and when it gets in that frequency and it starts moving around, your seat pressure will actually go away. And when I say go away, we don't know an actual number that it would go away, because you'd have to put a sensor underneath of it, but we do know that that is an actual situation where the spring is just not going to act right. It needs to be closer to coil bind. So what we have is we have one spring that's too close to coil bind and the other spring is too far away from coil bind. So the only way you can actually solve this problem is knowing that we had a couple sets of these. So they sent us 2 sets of this original spring that was in there. We have a new set and a used set. So we take the new and the old, and we're just going to go through them and just check clearance to coil bind, because that will change between all the springs, as I mentioned, and then we can make a set just for the intake. Situation here is that if I'm going to be off, I want to be off a little tighter to coil bind. Too tight, you know it. Too loose, everybody knows it. And as I said, it's because it'll go into that frequency and it'll start valve floating, and then you have issues with rockers and all kinds of other stuff. So I don't want to go down that road. And so I got the spring kit that was originally in there. I think that they had a coil bind issue, as you can tell from just changing the lock. The lock actually changed the install height, and we can just find springs that will fit the build for at least this one. Now, what this means for HeadGames is that we're not going to install anything into these heads until somebody comes out with a kit that actually fits. And it fits correctly, and it has the right distance to coil bind, and we can put a cam in it, and we can all the boxes are checked before we go and install anything in these. The good news is that we work very closely with GSC, and GSC Power Division said, hey, we can fix that. And we already got the spring, and they're going to make retainers and locators, and probably by the time this thing comes out, we will actually have a spring kit that will be available for it, or I should say they will, and it'll fit correctly. If you guys want to see more of this build, be sure to check out Nemtec Tuning's YouTube. All right, that does it for me today. Be sure to like, subscribe, comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Toodles.
HeadGames!